It's a very broad brush approach to our 205th anniversary, but I've attempted to cover things from the beginning to the end. So if you'll bear with me in bits and pieces, and we'll see how it goes. So, first of all, a lot of people up until number 5 Vicars Hill open to the public didn't know very much about it. And they certainly didn't know that Archbishop Robinson also founded number 5 Vicars Hill. He's well known for the other important buildings around Armagh, including the hospital and the observatory, etc., and of course the library, but not for Vicars Hill. But Vicars Hill was founded just 1 year after the library was founded in 1772. So just to give the presentation a bit of context for people who maybe don't know too much about number 5 or where we're located. The library is on the ancient hill of Armagh at the top of Abbey Street, just 4 doors to the left, or 5 doors to be precise, from the red post box is the location of 5 Vicars Hill, the former registry. And just across the road from the library is the gate and opening to the Church of Ireland Cathedral of Armagh. So the 3 buildings are very close together. And that's not by accident. It's very convenient for the Archbishop and the clergy who are doing day-to-day business. And it's very convenient for us now when we're involved in presenting these buildings and their contents to the public as part of our tourist operation. So, just a reminder of the man himself, Archbishop Richard Robinson, and the fact that he was the first Archbishop to come and actually live in Armagh permanently for a very, very long time. Back through the centuries, Armagh sometimes wasn't the safest place to be. Sometimes it wasn't too bad, but mostly it was the dean and chapter were the people who did the day-to-day running of this centre of Christianity. During the wars of the 1600s, definitely very difficult at times, but from 1700 onwards, Armagh is getting on its feet. And various archbishops are improving the city, or doing their bit to improve it, but they still don't have a permanent residence up here. So Archbishop Robinson had his plan for the development of the city, and part of that was building a grand house for himself, which we know as the palace, and also a library for his collection. But as regards practical work, he needed somewhere to keep his church records and secular records. And most of those historically had been kept down in Drogheda, where the archbishops lived. It was in the Pale, it was a safer place to live. And even in the early 1700s, it was just a better place to live, better accommodation, and close to the social and political life in Dublin. So they got quite comfy down there, but he came up here. So that's a photograph of the long room, as many of you will know. The next slide is the ancient hill of Armagh, looking south from the main entrance to St. Patrick's Church of Ireland Cathedral. So this is the original site of Christianity in Armagh, the site on the hill. The west door to the left is where the entrance to the cathedral is, and Vicars Hill is to the right. Looking at that neat little terrace of buildings, they look fine on a good day like that, and they're very functional, but it would be hard to say where the registry is there, but it is in picture. Some of you know, but some of you won't. So we go to the next slide. And I quite like this slide. And you can just imagine these row of houses going right back to George III period, and the view wouldn't have been much different than that of the houses. You can now see where the registry is. It's pretty much centre of the row, or appears to be centre. The only difference now and from most of its life was there weren't railings or the ramp up to the door. So here we are with a photograph taken from the roadway. And it used to be the road ran straight past this terrace of houses. I think it wasn't long after the terrace of houses was built that they started to seal off the road just because the traffic would have been quite difficult. When you look at the building, above the fan light window, above the front door, there's another little window, and that's the one room that is on the first floor. And it used to be the office for the registrar to do his work. Got a great view over the west door. You can actually see over my shoulder here, I'm actually sitting in that office, and you can see the balcony behind me and the big octagonal room with the various light and cupboards in it, etc. You'll see more of that as we go along. Over most of its life, this was a home to the valuable documents, not only of the diocese, but many also of the Church of Ireland on a national level. So it wasn't just for the local Armagh city or Armagh diocese, which covers County Louth, part of South Derry, East Tyrone, but it covered many other parts of Ireland, including some medieval records that were kept here, brought up from Drogheda. Next slide just emphasizes the link that Georgian period has with Armagh and vice versa. So when you're up here, and many people don't really notice the difference in the houses until they look closer, but numbers 1 to 4, those houses were built at the request of Archbishop Boulter in his will for widows of clergy. They're essentially 2 up and 2 down, maybe a little bit more than that, but they've got large gardens at the back. And it was mostly widows who maybe their husbands hadn't been just as well off as some of the clergy would have had those buildings, or it's very convenient, of course, for worship, etc. too. So those buildings are still lived in, numbers 1 to 4. They're of the King George II period, built in the early 1740s. Number 4 currently is a wee restaurant. It has been for the past number of years. From number 5 down the hill, and there is a slope down the hill, those are all King George III period, and founded at the request of Archbishop Robinson. The only other building that was not built to live in, apart from number 5, was the music room, which still exists a few doors down, and it extends to number 11. Number 11 probably is the most room of any house, because as you go down the hill, the roof height stays the same, but the buildings get a cellar and an extra floor. And that's where the Charles Wood house is, famous church composer. You'll notice the small windows of the George II period and the flat top door. And for the George III period, it's the large windows and the round top door. So the next slide is a cross-section of the buildings, and I have to give my thanks to Stephen Conlon for letting me use this cross-section that he drew for the library. It's a cross-section of the way the building looks. Can be difficult to see initially, but the first dome building that you see, that's the front room of the house actually. And then it leads on backwards towards the garden. So you have the front room. It has a high ceiling. It doesn't have a floor except for a balcony or gallery, narrow gallery around the edges of it. But it's a complete dome. And there are shelves along by the balcony where people could keep their records, ordinary people from the city who had important records that they wanted to keep or valuables, and you could keep them in the registry for a small fee. The small sort of hall that you see joining these 2 cross sections, that is the hallway linking the registry room, the main building, to the second room at the back, which is an extension but was built at the same time. It never had a balcony, but it still has the high ceiling. The reason for the high ceiling is it's built-in air conditioning of the time. It keeps the building cool in the summer and warm in the winter. There'd also been a fireplace in each of these rooms. We obviously don't use fireplaces anymore. We have underfloor heating. but that's the way the buildings were. Going back to that little corridor that leads into the second room, you can see a door there, and the door led out into the backyard. And you'll see it later on, it's been changed into the central gallery. So the building's primarily made of stone to protect against the risk of fire. And the wood in the building is kept to an absolute minimum. The stone walls covered in plaster, etc. And essentially that's the way it looked for most of his life up until the 1930s anyway, in the inside. And tell you a little bit about the documents that were kept here, spanning the 15th to 20th century. The documents are mostly written in Latin in the early period, but the records cover a vast range of subjects in both local and national importance. Home to thousands of important civil and religious documents. The registry was for many years the memory of Armagh diocese. Some of the records that would have been kept would have been involving property leased by the church, financial accounts, sheriff's writs, procedures of ecclesiastical churches, church courts, and so on around Ireland in some cases. So I think at this stage, probably best to cover the history of the building between when it was founded in 1772 and into the early 20th century. So the early period up until about 1850s, 1860s was the busiest period for the registry. The church had a lot of power, both ecclesiastical and secular, up to that period. And in 1850, there were actually 2 registrars and 1 deputy registrar working in this building. So quite a lot of work to carry on. It was a court of probate at one stage as well as all its other functions. But shortly after that, in the mid-1860s, by 1864, there was an act, the Civil Registration of Births and Deaths Act, which basically meant that a lot of the records that the church would have kept were taken over by the government authorities. So that reduced quite a lot of the paperwork that was coming in, but not nearly as much as what came down the tracks a few years later, which was the Disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. And that was whenever, with a push from Gladstone, the Church of Ireland was disestablished, gave up a lot of its land and a lot of its powers over secular matters, etc. A lot of those were given over to the state. So it was the end of an era in church secular authority, quite a difficult time for change, and the next few decades were spent just basically settling down the organisation, downsizing, if you like, and managing all the effects of that. So it meant that in the long run there were less records, but in the short term there were probably quite a few other records that had to be filled out, except re-handovers. And a large amount of the records as a result of this legislation also had to be sent down to the Public Records Office in Dublin at the forecourts on the banks of the Liffey. And that was a continuing feature right up into the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, mostly the old registry in Armagh was a repository for the diocesan records. And of course, in June 1922, we're coming up to the 100th anniversary of the great disaster with the forecourts, when in one of the incidents, the first incidents of the Civil War down south, the forecourts were the centre of a conflict between pro-treaty and anti-treaty forces. Building caught fire and was destroyed, and all the records in it were destroyed also. So we lost a lot of our records in that, and by that I mean Armagh Diocesan Registry. But fortunately there were quite a few records that the archbishops wanted quite close as well, so there were some that survived, including medieval registers, and they survived that particular incident, so there may be little treasures to find, and those records are mostly up in the Public Records Office, Northern Ireland, and the new offices up there. And for researchers, I think there probably is a treasure trove of information there if they have time to have a look through it and maybe translate the Latin medieval records. So going on from that, early 1920s, the building was just sort of ticking along, but not the best place to keep records. 20th century, there were recommendations for better methods of keeping records. And so it was decided by the governor and guardians that they'd build a muniment room in the library. And the muniment room is joined to the library on the ground floor, still there. So most of the records were moved down there, and to preserve number 5, they decided they'd let residents live there and adapted the house for that purpose. So from 1935 to 1997, the building was primarily lived in. Some records were still there, but there were people, various families, etc. there. The first resident was Robert Davidson, who was a gardener and around the cathedral grounds. So we come to this picture, and quite a nice photograph of afternoon tea with Esme Strain. Now, Esme was the last resident in number 5. We have a record of all the residents that have been here over the years. And if there's anybody out there who knows anybody with photographs of number 5 through the last century, would be very interested to see them for the archive. But this is one picture which I have to thank Mary Dawson for giving me. And Mary lives next door in number 6, the Green Lady House. And Mary's there. She's the lady with the dark hair. And she's still living next door, and we still have a nice cup of tea in her kitchen every so often. But this is Esme's kitchen, her living room. Esme's the one in the white cardigan with the blue top. And the young lady, I think she was going out with one of Mary's sons at that time. This would be the early 1980s. So Esme, that was pretty much her retirement home. She had a long, happy life. And she passed away on the 26th of October, 1997, and is buried just across the street here in the cathedral grounds. So when she passed away, we had to decide, or I wasn't here at the time, but Dean Cassidy, amongst others, I see Anne Cassidy there today, and the Carol Conlon, and later Dean Rook were all involved in the restoration of the building. We had to decide whether it be upgraded for modern day residents or restored. So it's no brainer, restore it. Difficult things getting the money. The money came from Heritage Lottery Fund in Northern Ireland, tourism. And for the rest of the presentation, I'll just have a quick look through the restoration project and what the building looks like today. So literally the building was stripped to the bare bones. As you can see, has a pretty dramatic picture. So that's if you come through the front door. In the old days, you wouldn't have got any further anyway. You'd have been in the front hallway, and business was done through a hatch in the door to the right. But going inside, those stairs lead up to the registrar's office on the balcony, and the corridor leads down to the other records room. It had steps which were removed to allow for access with wheelchairs. But at this stage, the building stripped back, paint taken off the steps, old plaster taken off the stone walls, etc., etc. So stone in the building, for those who are interested in that, mostly limestone, which is a local stone, and the Arma marble conglomerate, which is also from a local quarry. Call it marble, it's not pure marble, of course, but it polishes up well, and all the floor still remains Armagh marble. There's also red bricks whenever you peel away the plaster from the cupboard areas and the domes, and very beautiful pattern of red bricks, magnificent work. So next one is the registry room. So this is the registry room, main records room, located at the front of the building with views through the windows to the cathedral and beyond. Room's octagonal, as we said earlier, with an octagonal balcony. You cannot see the balcony here because the wooden floor was placed on the balcony, which is a strong cantilevered balcony, can take the weight. And that wooden floor, recent feature, installed in the 1930s, removed in the recent restoration to reveal the original. structure of the building. You can see some of the trouble that was went to restore the dome. You can see some of the red brick there. That red brick extends right over the dome. And then you put on a new wooden framework and a new lathe, etc., and attach plaster the same style as the old days. It's one of the reasons why it cost £500,000 to restore this building. But generous money from Heritage Lottery, Northern Ireland Tourism, and also a donation from the library funds. Next picture is going through the corridor and down through the small door into what we now call the Robinson Room. Never had a balcony, as I've said before. You can see the red brick in one of the alcoves where records would have been kept. The floor was lifted to put underfloor heating, and then the Arma marble stone was put back in place. The view is out towards the garden. Now, there didn't used to be a door there. We've placed a door there to have a viewing point, a balcony outside, but there were just windows there and a steep slope to the garden. But now it's more accessible for visitors. The scaffolding you see is what was put up just so that the builders could actually get at the dome and replace the plaster and tidy it up and repaint it. But no balcony there. And this is the transformation. So the registry room, and you can see that's pretty much the view I get whenever I get up out of this chair and look down over the railings. It's restored to its original design with most of its original features. The one feature that isn't original there is the door that you see, because that used to be a window looking out to the backyard. But the cupboard space, you can see it's there, fresh wood put in for cupboards to store and exhibit some of the records and books that we have. So most of the records in the Public Records Office up in Belfast, but the record to the bottom left of the cupboard that you see, that's a 1630 land registry or land indenture. So from the first plantation, really. And there's records for all sorts of secular and religious purposes on display. Balcony cantilevered, the floor is original. Even if you're in the winter, you get nice warm feet through the heating underneath. And the modern display feature in the center replaces the old bookcases and furniture or tables or whatever. But those modern display features can accommodate quite a few items as well as touchscreens. The theme of the building is collections and curiosities. And in this room, we remember Marcus Gervais Beresford, the second Beresford primate. And he collected early church bells, bell holders, etc., handbells. He also collected, so these are medieval exhibits. He also collected early Bronze Age items, which includes weapons and tools and so on. They're all from the collections that were deposited in the library by the Archbishop. And you could call number 5 almost like a shop window for the library, in that we just show samples of what we have in the library. If you don't ask, you don't get. So most people think it's books there. But if you're interested in these particular items, just let us know, put a bit of foreknowledge on it, and we might be able to find the items you're looking for. Next picture, just a close-up of the handbells. You can see more records in the background there. In this room, we also have a short history of music on the hill, which goes back a very long period. And we also have 2 silver maces, which go back to 1650s, but they were awarded to Armagh by James I to recognise a city status in the early 1600s. The axe that you see in the foreground, that particular table area, that's exactly where Esme Strain's table was, where she was having afternoon tea. The door behind is the door that was behind her. But the dividing wall, and there was a door through that dividing wall, if you remember the picture. I'll just go back a bit. So you can see the dividing wall there with the curtains across. So that was a stud wall that was put in. And on the floor above, there were 2 bedrooms. And then here we are. It's opened up again. But that cupboard behind where the records are, that's where she kept her pots and pans and a bottle of sherry for a cold day on the hill, as far as I recall. Next picture is what we now call the central gallery. or central hallway, which used to be the backyard. And we have pictures of it before and after, but this is after. And the main feature that you see is the Arma stone, the only stone that we know about in Armagh that's on public display in a museum. There's other ones that are on display elsewhere in fields. Quite a lot of them ended up in drainage ditches, but this one is a very special one. It was always known to be from the graveyard field, and you can see the earliest form of Irish writing, those little grooves at the side, the Armagh. We've got a code, as you see to the left of it, which identifies what that means. So it dates back to 5th century, possibly before Patrick came along. The cross with the Celtic influence, scholars tell us that was added on about 600 AD. The damage that you see top right of the cross, that was caused by a farmer in the 1870s who knew it was pretty important. He was probably trying to move things to get a bit more space for growing crops or whatever. But anyway, he was good enough to donate it to the library, but it was too weighty for the library floor. So it became the main feature in number 5 whenever we opened the building. The picture that you see is Armagh 1812. We've also got 4 maps showing the past 400 years in Armagh through good and bad times, the development of the city. And we have a timeline in this room which takes you from Patrick's time, 400 AD or 440 AD, right up to the present time. So it's all the religious leaders, but also key historic dates. So quite a lot of information packed into that wee space. And then we've opened up a wide area which takes you into the next records room and allows access for wheelchairs and the big buggies that you see these days for the kiddies. So this is the Robinson room. Primarily gives information on his life and times, primarily devoted to displaying sample items from his collections and curiosities, and these include coins, prints and gems. Quick run through of what we have. We've Roman coins, Greek coins, and quite a lot of other miscellaneous coins, medieval times, etc. on display. You can open up drawers where you can see them in more detail, and we have an LED torch which can let you see it in even better detail in a good light. Prints include Hogarth, Piranesi, quite a few other gentlemen who are stored at the library. You can also see these in larger form on the touch screen, which you see in the foreground, but you can see some of the Hogarth prints in the background. And they in particular are good fun for people who want a bit of morality tales, etc., and politics of the old Georgian times. The gems, they're basically seals, a bit like cameo brooches. They've got old Roman and Greek designs on them, etc. Mostly used as seals in the old days, but these were for display only, and they're part of the collection that's in the library. A man from Tassie did those, and Catherine the Great collected these as well, so he was in good company collecting those items. You know, this was to show off wealth amongst the gentlemen, etc., and their knowledge of classical things. The model in the centre showing Armagh 1812 is basically taken from that picture behind the Ogham stone. Highlights Robinson's building legacy and just the way the city's developing at that stage, about 10 years after he's dead. But it shows that he set the standard for others to follow. So the Mall, it's been turned into a public park everybody can enjoy, and that's where the gentry are starting to build their nice houses, a couple of which are museums now. They of various other features which I don't really have time to go into today. Just that little bit at the end, talking about the ancient history of Armagh can also be explored by moving through the rear doors. So we'll go to that area now. And you can see the rear doors there and the balcony and the steps going down. So before we come to that history, that you can see the garden itself, you can see the size of gardens that are at the back of these houses. Mary's next door is particularly well cared for, and nice pathways and so on. Our garden, we've got some money recently, or a grant recently, from Northern Ireland Museums Council funding to enhance what is in the garden, promote the green agenda, if you like, encourage more wildlife, and just a pleasant space for people to be in. So the money is going towards a bed on the left that you see there, broad bed, which will have Georgian flowers, bushes, herbs, plants, lots of scented shrubbery, etc. We already have buddleia bush and things for the butterflies. So hopefully that'll increase the birds, butterflies, and bees, and also other wildlife in the garden. The Archbishop recently planted a couple of rowan trees towards the bottom, and we've got a nice curb to contain it all. So that's going forward. Hopefully that'll be available for visitors to view in June, July. Just watching my time here, so I'll be very quick and go on to the slide on the right-hand side. And I can see faces all over it at the moment, but hopefully you can see the whole slide, because on the right-hand side, it shows the old road that leads directly from Armagh, the hill of Ardmagh, to Ammanmagh, the Navan Fort Hill, which goes back to the Iron Age and pre-Christian ritual, etc. So it's now called Windmill Hill, and you can also see the windmill from our balcony as well. But we believe in the old days that was built on our causeway was built there essentially with a direct path across the shallow Callan River right up to Navan. And the chieftain on the hill of Armagh, excuse me, would have gone there for festivals, etc. And people from all over the island would have gone to Navan Fort or Ammanmagh because it was a crossroads between all the ancient sites in Ireland. So in more recent times, peace process of 1005, we believe Brian Boru set up camp there. In fact, that's on record. And the only way he could have come to Armagh to copperfast and the claim of Armagh to be the centre of Christianity in Ireland was to come along that road, having made his peace with the O'Neills. Lots of more recent history as well. You'd have heard all the big battles in that area as well, to the northwest of Armagh, the Battle of Yellow Ford, Battle of Benburb. So very atmospheric place to be, and particularly the views there, and great sunsets to the west. To the left over the wall, that's the south. So it's ideal for a garden too. It's a sheltered area, gets good sunshine and some protection from the westerly winds. So I think that's it. A quick gallop through number 5, 250 years. Quite a history to it, but a very newcomer to Armagh compared to Armagh's ancient history. You see some references and sources there. Particularly recommend Ted Fleming's book, Ken Fleming's book, called On the Hill of Armagh. If you want to know about anything on the Hill of Armagh, I think he's covered just about everything and in great detail. So a great scholar and a great contribution to the history of the hill here. It's available in the Cathedral shop. The Armagh Diocesan Registry papers, if you want to know what's up in the Northern Ireland Public Records Office, you can have a look at the description of those in the library, but it includes some medieval documents as well as others.